struggling rancher saved a 39-year-old slave woman and paid the ultimate price. The rope creaked like an old door learning a new secret. It hung from a warped beam above the freight platform of Calico Spur, swaying over a woman with iron at her wrists and dust in her throat. Lantern light painted her in amber and shadow. She was 39 by ledger, older by scars. Brown hair streaked with silver clung to her temples, and a faint split at the chin, poorly healed, caught the glow each time she swallowed. Evelyn Hart, said the chalk on the signboard. Indenture violations property of Grigg Freight and Laundry. Step her up, rasped Silas Grigg. His voice sounded like gravel dragged in a tin pan. Tar black hat, buzzard pale eyes, spurs that rattled when he turned, as if they tried to warn the ground before he struck it. Last chance before we dock her rations, or hang her as example. Around them, boots crunched on cinders. Freight wagons whispered beneath canvas. A harmonica tried a brave note and died. Townsfolk glanced, then looked away, clinging to the safety of indifference. Evelyn's shoulders rose and fell once, slow, like she was trying to remember what breath used to feel like. She did not plead. She had learned long ago that pleading feeds wolves. Silas pinched the rope. Auction or punishment? Makes no difference so long as the books balance. His men laughed. The sound was thin, like poorly spun wire. From the edge of the crowd, a weathered figure shifted his weight, and the wood of the platform answered with a long complaint. His coat had been a respectable duster once. Now the hem was bitten, and the cuffs were frayed. He was broad-shouldered but stooped with days. A grey beard, rough as fence cedar. Joah Cutter, 51, owner of a half-drowned ranch called Bar C, more debt than cattle, and a limp that announced storms a day before the clouds tried. A green bandana hid the salt on his throat. His knuckles were sun-split and steady. How much for the rope? Joah asked, voice dry as old paper. Silas blinked, then grinned. Rope's free. It's the lesson costs. I'll pay for both, Joah said, raising a folded roll of bills that had been meant for fencing wire and winter oats. Her indenture and whatever lecture you think the world needs tonight. Evelyn didn't turn, but a tendon in her neck quivered. Silas's grin cooled into arithmetic. You buying labor, rancher? Buying a woman's last chance to stand on her own feet, Joah said, stepping closer until the lantern flame wrote new shallows in his scarred face. Silas licked his thumb and flipped a ledger. Then bid brave, old man. He tugged the rope until it sang and the crowd's hush deepened. A pistol clicked somewhere behind the canvas, and the night decided nobody would look away first. Silas Grigg believed in numbers the way preachers believe in rain. He kept his books in a cracked leather folio, etched with grease and ash. Each name had a price, each price a punishment if profit fell short. When he walked the laundry yard, steam hissed like snakes and the air tasted of lye. Girls barely tall enough to work a wringer strained at iron cranks. Boys with coal-ringed eyes lifted wet sheets that could have been soaked in winter rivers. Those taken as children stayed as they grew, because debt grows faster than bodies. Evelyn had come to him 25 years ago, a saloon girl's daughter who scrubbed floors until her hands wore the shape of the boards. The first debt was for a doctor after a fever. The second for the coffin of a friend. After that, Silas invented debts like a magician pulls scarves. Each entry in the ledger was a knot around the throat. When she grew into the strength of 30, and then the steel of 39, he called her reliable stock. Reliability was his word for folks who'd learned not to fight the chain. He lifted her chin with 2 fingers. You look well for punishment day, Miss Hart. I regret not hanging you week past. Mercy is a poor investment. Evelyn stared at a nail hammered crooked into the beam above. When storms came, it dripped brown like a wound that refused to heal. She held silence steady as a plate in trembling hands and willed herself not to remember. Not the childhood of being traded for a sack of flour. Not the time her hair was cropped for cleanliness and sold as wigmaker's profit. Not the winter she slept under split burlap and woke with frost webbed to her lashes. The rope whispered at her ear. Creak, creak, it knew every throat in the yard. Silas turned to the crowd. We do not hate her. Hate is wasteful. We correct her. Correction shapes profit, and profit carries the territory on its back. Without enterprises like mine, who launders the sheets at the hotel? Who scrubs the blood from the railroad doctors' aprons? Where would you noble citizens be, without my necessary cruelty? A woman in a bonnet tightened her shawl. A storekeeper examined his fingernails. The lawman, a deputy hired this month, pretended to study the moon. Bidding begins at $50, Silas sang. She washes, sews, and does not break. Anyone says otherwise can show me a better worker. Joah's jaw flexed. 50 was fence wire and seed oats and a farrier call. 50 was 2 months of feed and a boy he still owed wages. He thought of his cattle, hip bones like folded knives, of his barn door held shut with a latch he carved out of the handle of a broken shovel. He also thought of the day a Comanche woman had bound his thigh after a splintered post gored him, not asking what flag he rode under or what coin he carried. A stranger's mercy once kept him from bleeding into the prairie. Dead can be holy if you honor it. 100, Joah said, voice even. Silas's eyes shifted, small birds hunting worms. Now that's interesting. 200, came a voice from Silas's men. A sham bid meant to milk the roll. Evelyn's pulse stuttered. The rope hummed, hungry for breath. The bids climbed like fire up a curtain, and she knew when flames touch the hem you either run through or burn where you stand. Joah Cutter didn't much care for crowds. He preferred the honest grammar of wind and fence posts, the slow vocabulary of cattle, but his feet held where most turned. Boots crunching, he stepped onto the freight platform until lantern light made him a promise of sharp edges. His hat brim was curled by weather, his eyes the color of creek glass and worry. 300, he said. Silas tilted his head, calculating marrow. You've got a ranch to drown, Cutter. Buy yourself a rope and you can hang the debt faster. Joah ignored him. He looked at Evelyn, not like a man looks to claim, but the way a man checks a gate, testing for strain, listening for what might give. Ma'am, he said, as if the word itself could push back a lifetime. If I take you out of this yard tonight, it'll be to stand on dirt that pays you back for waking. I can't promise plenty, only fair. For the first time, Evelyn looked at him full. Grey-blue eyes rimmed red by lie and anger she'd taught to sit. She saw a man stitched together by small salvations, patched duster, mended bandana, a rifle oiled well despite everything. A limper, a listener. The West didn't change a face, it wrote in it. 4, Silas said. And we'll call it charity so I can brag to the Reverend. 450, Joah replied, throat tight. Oats and wire were emptying from his roll like a vein bleeding into cotton. That would put him in the hard winter with a smile and a prayer, and neither would shoe a horse. Silas pretended to consider. Sold, he drawled, before one of his men could lift the number again. Cash in hand, and she leaves with the cuffs on until my papers sign. Joah counted bills that did not want to be counted. The rope creaked a sigh like an old judge, who's tasted too much sorrow to be surprised anymore. When the last bill slapped Silas's palm, the foreman scrawled a receipt that smelled of oil and arrogance. Cut her down, Joah said. Silas held up a finger. A moment. Last audit. He leaned in close to Evelyn, letting the iron of his breath coat her ear. You don't run. He can't guard you day and night. And if you come back to me, which you will, the price doubles. That's law where my books are kept. He nodded to a man with a sword off. The cuffs were unlocked. The rope kissed her neck goodbye. Evelyn's legs wobbled once and found the ambition to stand. Joah shrugged out of his duster and settled it around her shoulders without ceremony. It hung heavy and warm, smelling of smoke, saddle soap, and something like cedar prayers. They descended the platform, boots crunching, eyes following. The deputy watched from under his brim, the tin star dull as a bad conscience. At the edge of the yard, Joah's mule snorted. The night gathered itself into a hard shape. Behind them, spurs whispered like snakes in dry grass. Silas wasn't done. Men mounted in shadow, and the road west narrowed to a throat. They left Calico Spur beneath a thin moon. Sagebrush rasped against stirrups. The river kept its secrets in the dark. Joah rode high in the saddle, despite the ache that lived in his thigh. Evelyn rode behind. Light as truth when you've spent too long under lies. He'd given her a blanket and a canteen and a promise that sounded fragile even to him. You should have kept your money, she said softly. Money. Left my company first time a colt kicked a fence. Rail, he answered. I keep what I can, mostly promises. The night split. Hooves in pursuit. 5 riders, then 7, fanning along the arroyo's lip. Silas's men, coats snapping, bandanas wolf-red in the moonwash. The first shot cracked the ridge. Dust spat beside Joah's boot, and the mule ducked into its own shadow. Down, Joah snapped, hauling them into the cut of the wash where cottonwoods twisted like old hands. Bullets stitched leaves and found bark. The air filled with powder, hot and metallic. Somewhere a horse screamed. The rope on Joah's saddle horn creaked as if it remembered gallows. He returned fire measured, Winchester knocking his shoulder like a stern friend. A rider toppled, his hat spinning away like a frightened bird. But numbers press like a herd when the gate breaks. A slug grazed Joah's ribs, stealing his breath. Another buried itself low in his thigh, reopening that old grammar of pain. He swore into his teeth and tasted rust. Evelyn's hands shook, then steadied on instinct honed at ringers and iron stoves. Tasks you do right, or you burn. She tore his bandana, packed the wound, cinched his belt as a tourniquet. "You will not bleed for a book that is not yours," she said, voice low and furious. Riders poured into the wash. One grabbed for her hair. She turned with a laundry hook Joah kept for bales, curved iron, quick as a hawk's beak, and scored a line across the man's wrist. He yelped, dropped his pistol, and fell under his own horse's knees. "North cut," Joah panted, pointing where the arroyo choked into a narrow defile. "Rockfall there. If we can get through, they'll bottle." They scrambled, boots slipping on shale that broke into coins beneath their heels. The mule's breath rasped. So did Evelyn's, though hers turned steady as she found a rhythm. Left, right, plant, haul. The same rhythm that had hauled years through a life not meant to survive. They reached the choke, just as moonlight found Silas himself on the ridge, black hat etched against a sky full of thin stars. He raised a hand and the riders held. He smiled the way a ledger smiles at a total. "Trade you a head start for the woman," he called. "Trade you your teeth for my time," Joah replied, raising the rifle. Silas chuckled. "Phone says you're not making sunrise." Joah felt the world tilt. He forced it level. He handed the rifle to Evelyn. "Hold the throat," he said. "Breathe between shots. Count to 2. Aim at the chest. Let the dust tell you how to walk the sight." She looked at him like a door opening. "I've never shot a man." "You've survived one," he said. "Shooting is just telling that truth louder," hooves thundered. Rocks began to skip. Evelyn planted her boots, rope creaking on the horn, and pulled the stock into her shoulder as the canyon decided which name it would keep, theirs or Silas Griggs. The choke did what arroyos were born to do. It turned many into one. Evelyn held her breath like a note in a hymn and let it go on the trigger's break. The first rider folded out of the saddle hard enough to silence his own spurs. The second flinched as rock sparks bit his cheek and lost his nerve. His horse shouldered another into the wall, and confusion bucked up like a frightened bull. Silas drove his mount straight down the throat, believing that fear is a tool he owned the way he owned the ledger. He saw Joah sag and spurred harder. When he rose in the stirrups to fire, the moon flashed on the iron ring each of his laborers wore. Evelyn saw the same ring reflected in 1,000 wash barrels, in the slick of rainwater that filmed the yard, in the eyes of a girl who hadn't made 10 winters. She set the sight on the center of him. Her shot shattered the leather of his gun hand, and the pistol spun away, clattering down the rocks. Silas grabbed for the reins with shock more than pain, and his horse, made nervous by echoes, shouldered into the wall. The impact jarred him free. He fell, not clean but pitched, one boot trapped in the stirrup, his body dragged as the horse scrambled for footing in the narrow. The rope he carried at his pommel flapped and caught on a slab. It tightened, and for a breath the canyon held its own breath. "Stop," he wheezed to his horse or the moon or the arithmetic that had finally failed him. The horse reared. The rope jerked. There is justice that comes with a judge's hand, and justice that rides with bad luck. Either way, the beam above the freight platform had a twin in this rock. The rope creaked once more in the west. Silas did not stand again. Joah slid down the wall until the dust made room for him. Blood leaked warm between his fingers. Evelyn was there, quick, gathering his weight into the circle of her arms. "Stay," she said, fierce. "I have stayed through worse than night. You can stay through this." "I can," he breathed, eyes fixing on her like a man picks a star and swears by it. "If you decide I should." The riders left, those who could, under a sky that had learned a new silence. The deputy showed late, hat in hands, and found Silas given back to the ledger he'd kept so tight. He looked at Evelyn and Joah, at the spent shells and the rockfall, and said nothing that mattered. Sometimes the law arrives to find the law already done. Dawn crawled into the arroyo on its knees. Birds discovered the business of mourning. Evelyn packed Joah's wound again with strips torn from the lining of his duster. She built a small fire only high enough to boil a rag. Her hands moved with the economy of someone who has done difficult work for so long That ease feels suspect. When Joah slept at last, she stood at the canyon mouth and watched the light claim the sage flats. On the third day, with help from a rancher neighbor who owed Joah the kind of favor men remember, they made it to Bar C. The gate hung crooked. The barn wore a hat of old snow in shadow. The cattle watched with the solemn patience of saints. Evelyn looked at the place and saw not ruin, but bones to wrap meat around. She stayed. She stayed to mend tack and teach a mule better manners and to laugh once. Then again, like a pump finding its water, over weeks, Joah traded the crutch for a cane, then for a hand laid on her shoulder as they walked the fence line. He paid her wages in cash and in choices, whichever she wanted most that day. Some nights they said nothing and shared coffee from a dented blue cup. Some nights they said everything. When a wagon from town rolled up with a lawman and a church lady come to ask questions, Evelyn met them on the step in a clean calico and the duster she'd kept, sleeves neat, hem mended. She gave them the short of it, and the long they didn't deserve. "I'm not property," she said calm. "I'm a person. I was a person the whole time." The church lady nodded like maybe she would try believing that better. Calico's spur changed. Not much at first. A laundry yard closed for repairs stayed closed. Girls and boys drifted away like steam that forgot to condense. Someone painted over the signboard. But the canyon remembers, and so do the small towns that feed on rumor, the way they feed on rail schedules. You can't unteach a place a lesson once it's learned where to look. Seasons sharpened the ranch into a place that knew its name when called. Joah's limp became a story he told in half a sentence. Evelyn's hands lost some of the lie and kept all of the strength. When calves came, they came loud and alive. When storms rose, the roofs held. When the winter wolves sang, they sang from farther hills. On a dusk-painted copper, Joah stood beside Evelyn at the fence line. The wind worried the wire like a fiddler trying a tune. Far away, a train called and no one answered. He reached for his hat, then changed his mind and reached for her hand instead. "I bought a chance," he said. "You turned it into a life." "No," she said, eyes on the rim where stars began. "We did the math different. We stopped letting someone else write our numbers." They watched until the dark filled with friendly noises, rope creaking on the barn hook, boots crunching where a hired boy carried straw, the mule thumping his stall because even miracles have habits. Evelyn thought of the beam in Calico Spur and the canyon that kept their names. Survival had built her. Choice would finish the work. If you were in Evelyn's place, 39 years tall with a ledger full of lies, what would you do the night the ropes sang your name? Would you fight? Would you wait? Would you trust an old rancher with a broken gait and a steady eye? If this story took you somewhere, like this story and subscribe so you don't miss the next ride. And if you want to see how the next battle unfolds, don't miss the next story. Subscribe now.